All right, guys, this is going to be about two-thirds of your note packet for this unit. It's going to discuss influences of Charles Darwin as we kind of build up to our understanding now of evolution, and also some forms of natural selection. So you're going to be looking at your Unit 9 note packet on evolution. You're going to be filling this worksheet in, this first page, second page, as we talk about influencers to Darwin. And then you'll fill in just this third page when we talk about types of natural selection. The speciation notes will be a separate set of notes that you will take in a little while. So these notes are kind of fun, not totally linear. So pay attention to what you're supposed to be writing where, and I'll try to point stuff out as we go, especially that first part. So we're going to be finishing this year talking about evolution. But before we talk about evolution, we need to talk about Charles Darwin. And before we talk about Charles Darwin, we need to talk about some people, some theories, some scientists who kind of led Darwin, this name that most of us know, to sort of land on the theory that he has related to evolution. So first of all, we have this thing called stratigraphy, and this is the study of the Earth's layers or strata. Here's kind of a simple little picture showing that the Earth is not composed of all one thing. It's composed of layers that are different depending on what was going on the Earth at the time that that layer was there. And over time, we have layers that build new layers that build up upon those old layers, and we end up with these thing called strata. So if you look at these here, we have layer F, which is this layer that's closest to the surface. Further down, we have layer Z, which looks a little bit different, right? We've got D that looks like some fossils in it, and then S, which is down very at the bottom. So if you want you to think about which of these layers would be the oldest, you're going to answer that on the Edpuzzle. Okay, related to stratigraphy is this Hutton and Lyell's theory of uniformitarianism. What this means is that mechanisms of geological change, so things that changed relating to the geology of our planet, are constant over time. Things that happen today are pretty much the same as things that were happening years ago, right? So earthquakes have always existed. Volcanoes have always existed. That's why I wrote here tectonics, right? So plate tectonics have always occurred or interacted in the exact same ways, right? So the way that we see volcanoes today is the way that volcanoes have existed pretty much since this planet was formed. Erosion is a not so exciting, but also very important, another example of that, right? Erosion is the breaking down and the movement of components of the earth, right? So we know that over time, things like rocks or even mountains can wear down, change shape, and pieces of that material move. That's an example of erosion. That happens now. It happened millions of years ago, and it happens in the same way. How did uniformitarianism influence Charles Darwin? Darwin could compare fossils of the past with organisms now. And he was able to do this because he knew that the Earth kind of always acted in the same way. And he could also rely on stratigraphy, or those layers of the Earth, to help him understand and compare fossils from long ago to organisms that lived on the planet now and lived there when he was alive. Okay. Another example here of stratigraphy is the old rock and the young rock were formed in the same fashion, just at different times. So we can see these layers in this mountainside. And we've got the younger rocks up on top and the older ones down below, but they're all being formed in the same way. That's another example of uniformitarianism. What does this mean? The Earth is really old. The thought used to be that the Earth was thousands of years old, but we know that the Earth is actually likely millions or even billions of years old. And we have proof of this because of our understanding of uniformitarianism and studying of the Earth layers. We can see that there are things in these layers that are much, much older than just thousands of years. Let's talk about a couple of people who further contributed to what Charles Darwin understood when he kind of started studying and came up with this theory of evolution. So Thomas Malthus wrote an essay on the principle of population. This was a very important essay for a lot of reasons. And the main point, this bolded thing, is what you probably want to write in his box on the notes. Eventually, population size is limited by famine and disease. So if we have individuals, whether they're animals or humans, living in a space that only has so many resources, at some point the population will have to stop growing. If this is true for humans, why not relate it to animals? So Malthus was talking about humans living in really confined spaces like in big cities, but we can relate this to animals as well. Next was Georges Louis Leclerc de Buffon. He was a naturalist, and he wrote a lot of actually scientific papers, but he wrote specifically this one called The History of Evolutionary Theory article. And his main observations, which might seem obvious to us today, but were actually pretty groundbreaking back then, were that species today are not the same as they were when they were created. So he had this idea that animals, plants, any living thing, they've changed over time to end up with the diversity that we have on this planet. How that happened, he wasn't fully able to explain, but he had someone that he mentored named Lamarck who kind of took this idea a step further. So again, what you want to write in his box is he observed species today were not in the same form as they were when they were created. Okay. Lamarck is a name maybe you've heard before. He proposed a mechanism for evolution, so an explanation for evolution called use and disuse. Okay, so that's probably what you want to write about him. And the inheritance of acquired traits explains how species might change over time. So again, he was a student of Leclerc de Buffon, and he had this really important theory called use and disuse and inheritance. So let's talk about what that means. But first, let's look at Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin developed the idea of natural selection in his book, The Origin of the Species. So we're talking about mechanisms for evolution. Evolution is basically the change in organisms over time. Again, if we go back for 1 second, Lamarck talked about use and disuse as the thing that caused evolution. Charles Darwin said something a little different. He talked about something called natural selection, and we'll talk more about what that means in a second. Darwin took a trip on a boat called the HMS Beagle, and he was a naturalist who was observing both living and dead organisms. And he saw patterns when he was on that trip. He saw patterns of diversity. He looked at living organisms and fossils, and he's most famous for looking at organisms on the Galapagos Islands. So if you look, this is kind of the trip that the Beagle took. So Darwin was really looking at organisms all over the planet. Okay. If you look, the Galapagos are these islands. You can't really see them, but they're labeled. These islands over on the west coast of South America near the equator. There's a lot of diversity, and we're going to talk about why that is. Darwin specifically was looking at Galapagos finches. Finches are a type of bird. They're small little birds, and there are lots of versions or variations of finches. So basically what Darwin kind of observed and then hypothesized was that finches somehow got over to the islands from the mainland of South America. And once they were there, they started populating and adapting to their environment. Over time, maybe because a couple birds got lucky and were able to fly a certain distance, or because the wind helped blow them, they started kind of moving from island to island. And then often once they got to an island, they couldn't necessarily move on to another one. So over time, we ended up with birds all over these different islands, but there wasn't a ton of travel in between if we're looking at the population overall. What Darwin observed was that depending on the island in the Galapagos he went to, he saw finches that had really different characteristics. Some had really big, thick beaks. Some had long, skinny beaks. Some had differences in coloration. Some had differences in their wing or feathering patterns. And he started to think, this is really interesting. All of this species of bird are relatively close together, but they look really different. And he wanted to know why. And his why sort of led him to this theory of natural selection that we're going to talk about a little bit more. But first, let's compare and contrast these two naturalists. The naturalist Lamarck, who we talked about earlier, was a French naturalist, while Darwin was an English naturalist. Lamarck correctly observed that living things change over time. So did Darwin. Darwin observed this on his voyage aboard the HMS Beagle. The main difference is, and this is what's most important, is that Lamarck proposed evolution by acquired characteristics. We'll talk about that in 1 second. Where Darwin proposed evolution by natural selection. We're going to talk about how those things are different. So the question here is, and the example we're going to look at is, can a giraffe stretch its neck to make it longer? Another way to say this is, can you change the traits with which you are born? According to Lamarck, again, his idea was evolution by acquired characteristics. If we had a giraffe that was born with a short neck and they lived near shrubbery that was on the ground, that giraffe would live its whole life with its short neck. However, Lamarck said that if a giraffe was born with a short neck and it lived in a place where the only shrubbery that it could eat was up high, that it could actually stretch its neck or change one of its physical traits in order to accommodate where that food was located. He also said that if that giraffe stretched its neck over time and then had offspring, that those offspring would also have that same new trait, long neck. Now, we know today that he is in fact not, let me go back. That he is in fact, he was incorrect, Lamarck was. Think about it this way. If you were to dye your hair purple and then have a child, would your child's hair be purple? We know no. We can use a lot of examples like that. But just because some physical attribute of you changes over time does not mean that you'll pass that trait down to an offspring. We are born with a set of, we know now, chromosomes that contain genes, and those are what determine, in combination with another person's set of genes, what your offspring will look like. So evolution by acquired characteristics is, again, this is what Lamarck basically said. And to summarize, he said, by using a trait, an organism can change that trait and pass that trait on to its offspring. Another name for this is use and disuse. Lamarck was wrong. You cannot change one of your traits and pass that trait on to your offspring. So he had a good idea about the fact that evolution was occurring, but his mechanism, the explanation for his mechanism, was incorrect. Let's clarify a couple of things. According to natural selection, populations change or evolve, not individuals. So while Lamarck said that one individual giraffe could change over time, Charles Darwin said that populations could change over time, because if the only giraffes that could reach those tall leaves were the giraffes that were born naturally with longer necks, then those giraffes are the only ones who are going to produce offspring. And over time, you'll see more giraffes with long necks because those traits survive. You'll see fewer giraffes with short necks because those traits do not. Only genetic or heritable traits may be passed to future generations. Again, me dyeing my hair purple does not make that trait heritable or genetic, so it's not going to be passed down to my offspring. And a population change is caused by change in an environment. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next little set of slides. Something happens to our environment that causes a population to have to change its characteristics over time to accommodate for that. This is the idea of natural selection. And this was the idea that Darwin sort of came up with to explain evolution. So now let's talk about types of natural selection. Today, we now fully accept this theory, and we know that it's true, and we observe it all the time in nature. I'm going to talk to you about the 3 types of natural selection, and I'm going to give you an example of each, and we're going to look at some graphs to kind of help us understand. There are 3 types of selection: directional selection, stabilizing selection, and disruptive selection. So we're just going to quickly take some notes on this. Directional selection is a mode of natural selection in which phenotypes at one end of a range of variation are favored. Allele frequencies shift in a consistent direction in response to selection pressure. That's a lot of words. I'm going to show you some examples, and I'm going to show you a graph that I hope will help. Main thing here, phenotypes at one end of a range are favored. Examples: peppered moths, rocket pocket mice, and antibiotic-resistant bacteria. What is she talking about? Well, I'll show you. First, let's look at this. This is a graph, right? And this is basically, you can think of this like 3 graphs on a larger graph, okay? This x-axis represents time, and the y-axis represents the amount of individuals. So we can see that at the beginning, we're looking at this population of butterflies as an example, right? We've got a few light-colored ones, we've got more of like the medium blue ones, and then we've got kind of a few of the darker, and then a very few of the very dark. So we've got the most in our population of that kind of middle phenotype, okay? What happens over time during directional selection is that something occurs that causes it to be not ideal to be on one end of the spectrum. So in this case, we see a shift from, we used to have kind of this even distribution with the light blue in the middle and an even distribution on either side of our dark and light. But what happened over time is we now see no more light butterflies. We see a few of those ones in the middle, and the ones that are over on the far right, those dark butterflies, are the ones that are being selected for. What does that mean? Those butterflies are able to survive in order to reproduce and pass their genes down to their offspring. Let's talk about a much more practical example. Maybe you learned about this in a history class. During the Industrial Revolution, or I guess I should say before the Industrial Revolution, there were these moths that lived on these trees, kind of like outside in the outskirts of London, of those big cities. And they're called pepper moths because they exist in two different colors. They can be kind of this like whitish color or this blackish color. It's two different alleles. Think of it like hair color or eye color. Before the Industrial Revolution began, these trees had white bark. So if you can see, one of these moths blends in way, way better to the tree bark than the other. And you can see that it's this lighter colored one. But what happened during the Industrial Revolution was that all of these factories were built and a lot of pollution was suddenly being released into the environment. And that pollution actually changed the color of the trees. So suddenly, instead of having white bark, we had this dark bark. And you can see what probably happens to this moth population. Suddenly, there were tons and tons of white moths, and they were very easy to see on that tree. What probably happens if they're very easy to see on that tree? I'll let you guess. And then I'll tell you, well, those moths are going to get eaten by predators, right? So suddenly there was a shift in the way that these trees looked, and there was a shift in the moth population where there used to be a whole bunch of light moths. Those moths are no longer being selected for. They're no longer living to pass down their genes. Instead, those black moths are. So we suddenly started to see a lot more of those darker moths in the environment. Again, here are just some pictures. You can see the difference, right? The white versus the black. And then after the Industrial Revolution, suddenly those black ones are going to be selected for because they can't be seen. They're going to be able to pass down genes to their offspring. White ones, no such luck. Another quick example, mice with coat colors that do not match their surroundings are more easily seen by predators. Rock pocket mice, basically, these are often found in the desert. And depending on where they live, they're more likely to be a certain color. So they'll either blend into like a certain color rock or sand so that they can't be spotted by predators. So that was directional selection, where we basically see a shift kind of from one end of the spectrum to the other, right? In the case of the moths, we saw that first those light colored moths were selected for, then something happened and they were selected against. So we saw a lower number of those moths and a higher number of the dark moths. That's directional selection. We see a movement in a direction. Stabilizing selection is our second type of natural selection. And it is a type of natural selection in which intermediate phenotypes are favored and the extreme forms are eliminated. So take a look at this slide. We see, again, back to our butterflies, we see that we start with a general curve, and slowly over time, the ones on the outsides kind of are no longer existing as often, and it's really just the ones in the middle that are selected for. An example are these social weavers, which are a type of bird. And body weight is basically going to be an example of stabilizing selection. So what we see if we look at this graph is that there's a major number of, or the highest number of social weavers who have kind of an intermediate body weight. Why? Well, if a bird is too small, at some point it will die, either because it's malnourished or it's unable to fight for resources and survive. If the bird is too big, though, it's going to be slower moving and be more likely to be consumed by a predator. So it's most ideal to have that mid-range body weight. We see this intermediate phenotype, this intermediate body weight that is the most selected for. And you can think about it like the graph is stabilizing. There's less on the outside, more in the middle. Last type of selection is disruptive selection. This is a type of natural selection that favors the two ends of phenotypes, and it doesn't favor the ones in the middle. Funky looking graph. Basically, over time, we see that there's this normal bell curve. Something happens. The ones that are intermediate in the middle, right? If you're looking at this, it's that intermediate color. They're selected against, but on either end, they're selected for. When might that happen in nature? Well, a good example are these birds called African seed crackers. And there are two possible variations of a beak that they'll have. They either have a really large bill or a really small one. And it has to do with the fact that there are a couple of different things that they can eat. They either need small bills to eat those things or large bills. Those intermediate ones don't work as well. So those birds that are born with really intermediate beaks, unfortunately, won't eat enough to reproduce, and pass their genes down to offspring. So this is not it's not a super common one to find in nature, but there are some examples. Again, noticing that the phenotype in the middle goes away, and the two on the end are what are left. That is all I have for you. I know that was a lot. We're going to kind of recap this again in class. Make sure that you have the notes for this filled in. You should have filled in all the way through the bottom of this.